Welcome to this week's edition of Prep Zone Extra Points, sponsored by John Hoffer Jeep Chrysler. This week featuring Rick Peterson, Tim Bisel, and Brent Maycock.
Hey, high school sports fans. Welcome to another edition of Extra Points. I'm Tim Bisel, the executive sports editor here at the Topeka Capital-Journal and CJOnline. Once again joined by our two prep experts, Brent Maycock and Rick Peterson. Fellas, the playoffs, I guess, started last week, but it felt like they kind of started in earnest this week, for me anyway. And we had some really good games as far as our local teams are concerned. Real quickly, I'll run down the scores and then just basically turn it over to you guys. The game of the week, kind of for city teams, was played in Manhattan tonight. Washburn Rural gets a 24-21 win over Manhattan. Big win for the Junior Blues. In other city action, Hayden rolls Osawatomie 55-34, and Seaman dominates KC Turner 62-14. Fellas, that's a pretty good week for our city teams, isn't it?
Well, it's a huge victory for Washburn Rural for several reasons. They're now 7-3, which is their most wins since 1996. They've had their first two playoff wins since 1992. And even more importantly, they snapped a 22-game losing streak against Manhattan. Add to that the fact that they avenged a 28-6 loss in the second game of the season, shows improvement. And two, they did it on the road.
Absolutely.
So a big win for Steve Bueller and his ball club. And, going into this season, Coach Bueller and I talked about the fact that they needed marquee wins against 6A teams. They could have got Junction City. They did get Topeka High, and they did get Manhattan. So their goal for the season, they really achieved that by getting some marquee wins, and they're not done.
And that's right. And if you're going to get a marquee win, doing it over a 9-0 team in the playoffs,
right.
That's about as big as it gets.
Yeah, and like I said, and turning around from an earlier game when, even though they lost 28-6 in that first game, they did a pretty good job defensively against Manhattan. They just gave up a ton of big plays in third and long and some fourth down plays and stuff like that. They cut that out tonight.
Brent, you're really familiar with Manhattan, obviously, as our area guy. Did this performance by Rule surprise you at all?
It surprises me a little bit in just the sense that, Manhattan kind of controlled that first game, but it doesn't surprise me in the sense that we've seen this out of Manhattan before. They've had a lot of teams in recent years that have gone 8-1, 9-0 in the regular season and just don't get that same whatever going in the playoffs and get early exits a lot earlier than you might have expected them to lose. And this was another year where 9-0 and now they're done and this was a Manhattan team you really didn't expect that from. Very senior dominated on both sides of the ball, especially up front on the line. But, Rural comes out, gets some early confidence. They're tied 14-14 at half, and then they kind of take control of the game in the second half, and Manhattan gets a late touchdown. But, it's a great win for Steve Bueller and Washburn Rural.
Ian Trapp and that Manhattan offense have been dynamite all year, so Rural must have done pretty darn good defensive effort against that team.
Trapp still had a huge game, but what maybe the biggest point tonight for the defense was in the fourth quarter, they stopped Manhattan at the 1 and get a huge stop that kind of protected that. Another thing I want to throw out, Rural's place kicker Ross Boyd, who's had a very good year, is also a standout for their soccer team, a captain and an all-state soccer player. He was with the soccer team in Wichita tonight. They throw a freshman in there, Joey Blakely, who kicked a field goal to put them ahead in the fourth quarter. So, and then they got a Hunter Browning touchdown to put them up 24-14 before Manhattan scored late. Then after Manhattan scored late, Jordan White, the sophomore quarterback, had two huge runs to allow them to run out the clock.
Yep, another big night for Jordan White and Browning, as you said. Moving on to the two games that you guys covered today, we'll start with Seaman Pistol. You were there for the Vikings. who, as I said earlier, rolled over Turner 62-14. Another impressive week for the Vikings.
Yes, and that's their first 8-win season since '06. So it's been 10 years, and they're now 8-2 after going 2-8 last year. They've had a huge turnaround, and they just did exactly what they needed to do tonight. Take control of the game early. If you're the favorite, you never want to let a team think they can beat you. Turner turns it over on their first possession. Seaman scores. Turner forgets to cover the kickoff. Nick Steiner gets the kickoff. Seaman scores. Turner goes for it on 4th and down. Doesn't get it. Seaman scores. All of a sudden it's 27-0 at the end of the first quarter, and they roll from there.
We've talked a lot about Glenn O'Neill during these shows, but man, I don't think we can say enough about the job that guy has done, can we?
Yeah, not surprising at all. I mean, I've been around Glenn enough covering 3A state basketball and get to see him down there just about every year and see him win it just about every year I've been down there too. So I'm not surprised. I think he's a great coach, and he's a great players coach. People really enjoy playing for him, and I saw that throughout the years covering Scott City, how much those kids just really respond to what he does, and obviously he's gone in and done the same thing with Seaman right away.
How'd Cowan look tonight, Pistol? He has kind of been their offensive catalyst, but it looked to me like they spread the ball around to a lot of guys today.
Well, they had 9 ball carriers, first off, and he only attempted 9 passes, but he completed 5 of them for 140 yards and 3 touchdowns. Nick Steiner had 3 catches for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. So they did spread it, but whenever they needed a big play, they needed to get a big run, or Cowan had hit a big pass. So they just did exactly what they needed to. Now it gets really tough because Aquinas comes in next week.
Yep, should be a good one. Brent, your game tonight, as we said earlier, Hayden rolls 55-34, I believe.
Yep.
The Wildcats looked like they really had it going early on. The second half was a little bit different story, though.
Well, it was a weird game where whatever Hayden wanted to do offensively, they could do. I mean, they moved the ball at will in the first half. They spread the ball around. 5 different backs had at least 24 yards in the first half. And it was just simple carries up the middle, nothing fancy. They just dominated. But defensively, it was like a whole different team out there. And after making a couple early stops, they couldn't get a stop against Osawatomie. And they got out to they scored 36 straight points and got out to a 43-7 lead. And I thought, okay, this is going to be, a 58-7. We're going to get out of here by about 9 o'clock and running clock. And then they just couldn't get a stop. They just couldn't stop. And Osawatomie, again, like Hayden, not doing anything super fancy, little toss sweeps. And the Hayden defense just did not rise to the challenge. It never got to a point where you thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a ball game. But at the same time, I know the Hayden coaches were just frustrated as all could be with their inability. And it wasn't like this was a mop-up duty touchdowns. This was against the first teamers for the most part. And so it was a game that Hayden really dominated offensively, and they gave up 430 yards defensively, and I know they're not going to be happy with that.
I wouldn't want to be at that practice.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Pistol. In a strange way, that might be a good thing for this team because it might allow the coaches to really get the players' attention. You win relatively easily, but the coaches have a lot that they can pick apart with this.
Well, and also kids, particularly with social media, newspapers, radio, and all that, they know Osawatomie was 2-7.
Sure.
They knew that they were going to win this game. So sometimes, as much as you preach not to, sometimes you tend to get a little lackadaisical and things like that.
And their defense hasn't lately been great against the run. Santa Fe Trail didn't score many touchdowns, but they racked up a lot of rushing yards. And Holton, obviously, in their game, had a lot of rushing yards. I think outgained them by 150 yards in that game. So their defense has been giving up yards. Now they've been limiting touchdowns by the other team, and tonight they gave up more touchdowns than they had been. But if they're going to continue on towards a state title, they're going to have to at some point learn how to stop the run.
Absolutely. There's a lot of games that we could touch on. Most notably, I guess, would be Hutch's 42-41 win over Junction City in overtime. What else kind of jumped out at you guys tonight from either around the area or around the state for that matter?
Well, the Hutch Junction City. I was kind of reading some of the Twitter feeds from that game from the Hutch newspaper, and they called it one of the best games they've ever seen down at Gowan Stadium. And Junction City, just traded blows. They got out early and hit some big plays early, and then Hutch scores first in overtime. Junction City goes for the win, gets stopped a foot shy on their 2-point conversion. Hutch pulls out the win, but it was kind of a wild night in the playoffs. You had some games that were just mind-boggling. Blue Valley, undefeated in Class 6A. They're tied 35-35 in the second half with Olathe South, which has not had a great year at all. Shawnee Mission East has to get a 2-point conversion to beat Gardner Edgerton, which was a 3-win team coming into the playoffs. Undefeated Garden City goes down to Free State. Now we know Free State's a really good team, and then that one doesn't surprise me, but still they go down. Columbus in Class 4A Division II, they get beat by Girard, who now will play Hayden at Hayden, and then that was a huge game. Columbus had only one loss, and that was by 1 point going into tonight, and had beaten Girard earlier this year by.
And that was a huge game for Hayden, because now Hayden does not have to go.
They don't Columbus. And a huge game for us because we don't have to figure out how to get somebody to Columbus. Meade gets beat by La Crosse tonight. There were just a lot of great games. Lawrence loses on a last-second field goal to a team it beat by 20-some earlier this year. Shawnee Mission West goes down to Blue Valley North. It was a wild night in the playoffs. I mean, there were some games out there, and Derby even had their hands full for a little while with Wichita Northwest before I think they hit them with like a 25-point explosion. But Wichita Northwest gains 409 yards in that game against a Derby defense that hadn't given up anything to anybody all year. So Goddard beats Carroll in a great game. That Goddard had been about the hottest team in Class 5A, but to beat Carroll in the playoffs is something not many teams do. And so for them to go do that, huge win for Goddard. So it was a really good night for the first week of the playoffs. That's for sure.
And we don't have long to catch our breath.
Nope, back at it tomorrow.
We got 2 more area teams, Rossville and Silver Lake in action. So.
Yeah, and those will be great games. Rossville goes to Sabetha to play the Blue Jays. Silver Lake home against Nemaha Central in a battle of 10-0 teams. Number 1 Silver Lake, number 5 Central. That'll be a great game. I think both those games, I wrote in my story that ran in the paper, those games had feels like they should be state semifinal type games rather than second round playoff games. And for those playoffs, we're real early, but those should be some great games tomorrow.
Absolutely. Well, that will wrap it up for this week. We look forward to recapping some of those games and all the action next week. Tune into CJOnline and PrepZone.com for all your high school coverage. Thanks again.